Well, hello everyone. So here we are for another Bible study in the book of Ecclesiastes. Today we're going to be going through chapter 3 and 4. Chapter 3, I think, is one of my favorite chapters, and then chapter 4 is kind of an advancement of chapter 3. Um, we're going to get into some kind of deep topics, mainly about the idea of eternity, and then we're going to kind of get into the idea of evil a little bit as we go through chapter 4, and then we're going to kind of go back to eternity. So, if you're joining me, I hope you open up your Bible. We'll get started here. So we'll start here at chapter 3. We start off with this little poem that the author has written. So verse 1 says, "For everything there is a season and a time for every matter under heaven." And here begins the poem at verse 2. "A time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to pluck up what is planted, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to break down and a time to build up, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to cast away stones and a time to gather stones together, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to seek and a time to lose, a time to keep and a time to cast away, a time to a time to tear and a time to sow, a time to keep silence and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace." So here in this poem, we see just about everything that man can do. There is a time for everything, and it's kind of just this really nice poem here in the middle of the beginning in the book. But I was kind of thinking about it, putting it in respect to eternity, is when we think of all the things that there is to be done here on this earth, here with our lives as humans, we can't help to think that we have a time slot to do it in, meaning that it starts and then we can begin and then it ends, thus forbidding any more opportunities to do things that humans can. So, in a fancy way of saying, that's a fancy way of saying that we all die. And sort of the interesting thing about death is that so often we kind of it kind of puts life in a very different picture, right? Because when someone dies, especially, sort of suddenly, uh, death is death though, but when someone dies sort of unexpectedly, you can't help to think that some of these things that humans do, here it says in verse 4, there's a time to laugh and there's a time to dance. When we die unexpectedly, it never crosses our minds that one day we're going to laugh for the very last time, and one day we're going to dance for the very last time. One day we're going to eat our last meal, and one day we're going to tell those closest to us that we love them for the very last time. And that's something that's really moving to me, to realize that sort of these things that we kind of take for granted about life every day is something that it's going to end. That means that there's going to be a last time. There's going to be a last time where you open up your front door and walk into your house. There's going to be a last time that you get in your car. There's going to be a last time that you see your best friend, and it's really sad if that's just it, right? But I'll get into see how this ties into eternity in a minute. We'll keep going. So here chapter 3, verse 9. What gain has the worker from his toil? I have seen the business that God has given to the children of man to be busy with. Here, verse 11. This is one of my favorite verses in the Bible. He has made everything beautiful in its time. Also, he has put eternity into man's heart, yet so that he cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to the end. Here at verse 12 now. I perceive that there is nothing better for them than to be joyful and to do good as long as they live. Also, that everyone should eat and drink and take pleasure in all his toil. This is God's gift to man. So here in verses 9 through 13, we have this idea of eternity brought in. And we go here to verse 11. I'll read that again. He has made everything beautiful in its time. Also, he has put eternity into man's heart, yet so that he cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to the end. So it's saying that kind of deep within us, there's this big hole, sort of, and only eternity can really satisfy that promise of eternity. And it's kind of interesting where it says, so why did God put eternity into man's heart? And it says, so that he cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to the end. So like when it's saying find out, so it's kind of saying figure out, to study. So there's really no way to grasp everything that God has done, that there's so much more beyond what our knowledge can give us, what the power of our cognition can give us. And so all we can do is try, though, right? Try to study everything, try to learn everything. And it's interesting how we go through life and we learn things, we study things, and we do things, and nothing ever sticks, right? Sometime we'll learn something that will just be absolutely amazing, and then we think it's the greatest thing that we've ever learned, and as time goes on, that effect fades, and sometimes you might even look back at that time and say, man, I wish I still had that feeling that I had when I first learned that. And then also, when things are done, you do something absolutely great. Maybe you do something bad. Maybe someone does something good, great, bad to you, and maybe you witness something just away from you. And whatever it is, unfortunately, we have this tendency to have that effect fade. And I noticed when I was going, or as I go through life here, there's something within me, really deep down within me, that is just never satisfied with anything. I mean, even think of some of the things that people in this world today like to go after, that thing that they want to have sustain them for the rest of their life. We think of money, and maybe a job, maybe power, maybe even like sensual pleasure. And we see that even these things don't last. With money, it can be gone in an instant. With maybe the markets go down one way, and then, but also too, it's like you kind of spend your life for money, for your job, for power, and then when you make that your idol that you worship, you pursue it at the expense of other things, and oftentimes at the expense of other people. And then it never sustains. The jobs don't last. Even if the jobs lasted, our bodies don't last long enough to do it. I don't think money lasts, because there's always going to be someone richer than you, someone who spends their money smarter than you. And then at the end of the day, you get close to the end of your life and that money, maybe you have so much of it, but what use is it to you if your life is about to end? And maybe you only have, maybe since you made money your idol, you have family that doesn't love you because you never loved them in the first place. And then the money's just gone, given to people you never loved, given to people you didn't know. So things that we see things that they're just not sustainable. So we really want this idea of eternity, and to really drive this point home, I think one of the most eternal feelings that we ever get is love. And think of it this way, this is how my mentor gave it or told me. He said, so often in love songs, it's inevitable that in a love song you're going to hear the word forever. You know, there's just this deep thing within us that we want this love to last forever. And especially when we reflect on the pain that hits us when love is taken away from us, we want that probably above anything else. When you've experienced true love, we want that to remain forever. And you know, I think the author has a really good point here, where when you we have this deep desire for there to be eternity. And if you think about it, everything that we desire in this world is actually there for us. So if we desire food, we can get food. If we desire water, we can get water. If we desire a relationship with a person, we can get that. If we desire an adrenaline rush, we can get that too. If we, I mean, think about it. I mean, you name it. If we desire to know more, we can get that. If not by learning from what others have learned, we go out there and learn it firsthand for ourselves. But then we have this lone desire of eternity, and I think eternity is actually the strongest desire of them all. And I think that's good evidence that says that there might be an eternity. I think it's so misplaced, that desire for eternity. Like, how could you say we're just products of evolution when all of our desires are met here on Earth, except for the biggest desire of them all? You know. So we keep going here, that the author says, I perceive that there's nothing better for them than to be joyful and to do good as long as they live. Also that everyone should eat and drink and take pleasure in all his toil. This is a gift. This is God's gift to man. So what the author is saying here is, look, in chapter 1 and 2, and here in the beginning of 3, everything comes and it goes. All is vanity, especially we see in chapter 1 and 2. But the best thing you could still do is to be joyful, to do good. And this is God's gift to man, taking pleasure in your toil. You know, there's a reason why in the Garden of Eden, you know, in Eden, God gave Adam work. You know, it's basically heaven on earth, and God gave Adam work. So that's a really important little passage that I wanted to spend a lot of time on. So we'll move on to, here we are at verse 14. I perceived that whatever God has endures forever. Nothing can be added to it, nor anything taken from it. God has done it so that people fear before him. That which is already has been, that which is to be already has been, and God seeks what has been driven away. So here it's kind of reflecting on verses 9 to 13, kind of giving you an answer. It's saying whatever God does endures forever. And I think it's kind of interesting. You could maybe take it back to Genesis, where it says God made man and it was very good. And you could draw the two together, saying that there's a part of us that remains forever. So we have here God being the only thing that lasts forever, this eternity, right? And so that kind of says that, okay, if we do desire eternity, then how do we get it? And Solomon, the author, says, follow God. And so we move on into verse 16. Moreover, I saw under the sun that in the place of justice, even there was wickedness, and in the place of righteousness, even there was wickedness. I said in my heart, God will judge the righteous and the wicked, for there is a time for every matter and for every work. I said in my heart, with regard to the children of man, that God is testing them, that they may see that they themselves are but beasts. For what happens to the children of man and what happens to the beasts is the same. As one dies, so dies the other. They all have the same breath, and man has no advantage over the beasts, for all is vanity. All go to one place. All are from the dust, and to dust all return. Who knows whether the spirit of man goes upward and the spirit of the beast goes down into the earth? So I saw that there is nothing better than a man should rejoice in his work, for that is his lot. Who can bring him to see what will be after him? So I think right here, the author's really getting into this kind of that saying that death is the great equalizer. And but then at the same time that there's God will judge the righteous and the wicked. And so here we see that so this is kind of that equalizer moment that whatever we do is judged, and that there is a judge for all that we do. So I like to I think another piece of evidence for eternity is that when we look at things of righteous people and when we look at things of wicked people, so what good is there to be a righteous person, and then how is it okay, or why is it so bad that wicked people exist, right? So I think of there's so many examples of wicked people, and I think the one that kind of drives this point home, this idea of judgment, eternity, is actually there's a lot of really like tyrannical regime leaders over the course of history, but I think the one that is the best evidence for this, the best example, is the case of this guy named Pol Pot. So he had his communist regime. I think it was in Cambodia. I could be wrong on that. But so the kind of the interesting thing about Pol Pot is that he kills millions of people. He just kills millions of people indiscriminately, meaning not just men, children, and women too. And I mean, he even got little kids as young as like 10 to 12 years old to kill their own families. And I mean, this guy was, you might even say, the definition of evil as best as a human can manifest it. And you want to know how he dies? He dies in his sleep. There's no torture. There's no violent death. Kind of things that maybe your gut kind of wishes that he would have received. But no, he doesn't receive that at all. He just dies in his sleep. And I think that's the worst thing, because if someone can do that much damage, that much evil, then how come it hurts everyone around to see that? And how come there's this lasting imprint of it, all to suggest that there's nothing, that it's meaningless, that there's no judgment for it? justice doesn't seem to be served. And there's something so wrong about that. Going back to what I was saying in the first video, we don't have emotional reactions to things that don't exist. And we see that we have this deep emotional reaction to see that justice should have been served, but it's not. But then going back to what I was saying earlier in this chapter about this idea of eternity, this is another example that I think proves my point, that maybe this life can't offer the justice we think, the justice we wish could be deserved. So maybe that justice can be served at some point. Ultimate justice, true justice, in its purest form, brought by the most perfect, most powerful being. I think we can definitely take solace in that. You have peace of mind. So kind of to wrap up, chapter 3 here, he's kind of saying, this is when he gets really nihilistic, and he doesn't really mention God that much. He's just saying we start from dust, and dust is all to return to, and kind of saying like there's no difference between man and beast, so therefore rejoice in his work. And so I think that just goes to show that if this all is meaningless, if all of this is by chance, the universe, the earth, each and every one of us, if this is all just by mere chance, then we're no different than the animals who act the way that they do. We're no different. There's no such thing as good. There's no such thing as evil. And just work. All you can do is just work and take joy in that. So move on into chapter 4. So we have this passage, evil under the sun. Again, I saw all the oppressions that are done under the sun, and behold, the tears of the oppressed, and they had no one to comfort them. On the side of their oppressors there was power, and there was no one to comfort them. And I thought the dead who are already dead more fortunate than the living who are still alive. But better than both is he who has not yet been and has not seen the evil deeds that are done under the sun. So this is really kind of getting into the idea of evil, right? And before I really became a Christian, I always thought that the argument of evil was the best argument against Christianity. And then having to see what Christianity says about evil, about how they address it, I actually think that Christianity deals with it better than any worldview. So to kind of give a little mini apologetics plug on this is, what other worldviews are there? Because here's the thing, with evil, no one gets by. Everyone has to deal with it because we all know it to be true. So what do the worldviews have to say about it? Let's give atheism a shot. Well, if you follow atheism and you stick to evolution as your core, as the foundation of your worldview, I want to say too that you can believe in evolution and then not be an atheist. Evolution doesn't have to be your foundation of the worldview, but so often with atheists, that is evolution and then the Big Bang all by chance. So if this is all by chance, if we're just products of evolution, going back to what I said a few minutes ago, then it's just all by chance. It's meaningless. There is no good and evil. We're no different than animals. We're no different than, I think, bears who kill their own offspring. We're no different than them. And I think that's actually a horrible answer because, like I said, we don't have emotional reactions to things that don't exist. So for there to be a worldview that says that evil doesn't actually exist, And I think too, some might say, okay, well, evil is just a construct. Evil is just made up. And I really don't think that's true, because when when colonization was coming on in the Americas, of course, you have your tribes who practice, human sacrifice and do awful things, but you actually find in a lot of tribes that they valued a lot of the same things that Westerners did. Although technically they were Westerners, but I digress. So what the Europeans did, I should say, and Europeans were very Christian. And so what does that say? People who have been untouched for some say have been untouched forever. Some say for a very long time, but either way, it's a very long time that they've been untouched by people from Europe and Africa. And how come that they come to draw upon the same moral reasonings that we do? Not we do. They did. Europeans did. Sorry, my bad. Although I am European in ethnicity, but so I think that morality, that good and evil, definitely exists. And then, like, going back to what I was saying, what do other worldviews say? I think Buddhism says that it's just an illusion, and I really don't buy that either, because I don't think there's anything more real than pain, um, that we can feel. And there's this Johnny Cash song called "Hurt," and he says, "I hurt myself today to see if I still feel." And I think pain's one of the realest things that we could feel. So how on earth could that be an illusion? So what does Christianity say about it? Christianity says, well, here we are. We can have this loving relationship with God. God wants us to have a loving relationship with him. That's what the Bible says. And the first commandment is to love God with all your heart, mind, and soul. The first commandment that Jesus gives, not out of the 10 commandments, but so if we have to love God, love also implies an action. Love is actually a sacrificial thing. It's not this emotional feeling that we have. It's something you get as a product of doing things for others. And so you do the actions that God wants you to do, and you do love for him, or no, you feel love for him. And so when you imply that action, that means that there has to be a choice. You have to choose to do things for God. You have to choose to give your heart to God. You have to choose to love God, because if it's forced and coerced, is it really love? So what that means is that people can choose wrong. People can choose badly. They can choose not to love God. So then we get into this idea that Christianity says about sin. Well, sin is by definition rejection of God. A sin is an act of rejection of God. Sin in its entirety, say you don't love God and you turned away from him. So then you could say that life is of sin. It says it's talking about in the New Testament, when someone is saved, they were dead in sin, and now they're alive in Christ. I don't think that's an actual quote. It's a paraphrase more though. So love has to be chosen. So if you choose wrong, you could go into sin, and then that's when we see that evil, right? Because the Bible talks about that all the time. What does sin look like? Sin looks like murder coming from hate. Sin looks like adultery coming from lust. Sin looks like stealing coming from jealousy. All of these actions that can be just horrendous. Murder blowing up the scale to genocide, just all these evil things. And then we kind of get into, okay, so So that's free will. So God has to allow it to happen because he gives us free will. And and that some of that evil is the product of free will. And there's a lot smarter people who go into the idea of evil and what the Bible has to say about it. They say it much better than I do, and they talk much longer than I do. But I just want to wrap up because with this idea of evil, because I still have more text to get to. But you may think that God can't understand what it means to feel suffering and evil, but I would just encourage you to look at who Jesus was and what Jesus did and what Jesus means, because Jesus took the most evil act, the most evil form of torturing someone. He took it all on himself, and he was the least deserving of it. And God feels our pain that way because we know that Jesus is one of the three of the triune God. So Jesus is God, and God feels that. He's felt that. He knows what we're going through. And then that goes back to what I was saying about eternity. That sense of evil, it kind of tells us things are wrong. Things should be another way. And that kind of gives us a clue that maybe after this life, things will go to how they ought to be. So that's all I kind of have to say about evil in a very condensed way. So here we'll finish it out at verse 4 in chapter 4. Then I saw that all toil and all skill and work come from a man's envy of his neighbor. This also is vanity and a striving after wind. The fool folds his hands and eats his own flesh. Better is a handful of quietness than 2 hands full of toil and a striving after wind. So here he's saying that even though that it should be your duty to take joy and pleasure in what you've toiled and what you've worked after, it's still not enough because of the sinful way of man's heart, that even it can come from envy, and it could come, and toil can be bred out of envy and jealousy. So there, it's still twisted. It's still not enough. And then we get in here at verse 7. Again, I saw vanity under the sun, one person who has no other, either son or brother, yet there is no end to all his toil, and his eyes are never satisfied with riches, so that he never asks, for whom am I toiling and depriving myself of pleasure? This also is vanity and an unhappy business. So yeah, his eyes are never satisfied with his riches, because I really like this quote by Jim Carrey. I really like his movies. I don't really like him as a person. Sorry. Not sorry. But he did say this one nugget of wisdom, which I found very impactful. Jim Carrey, for a little while, he kind of went off the map and no one really knew where he was or what he was doing. And then when he kind of started slowly coming back on, he had a huge beard, long hair. And I guess he went into this like spiritual journey. And he said, I wish everyone could have, sorry, this isn't a direct quote, just a paraphrase, but he said something along the lines of, I wish everyone could have this much money so that they could see that this is not the answer. So when you have all these riches, all of this money, I think it's so easy to just get desensitized to what we thought was going to last forever. Oh, when I get this car, it's going to be great. When I get this house, it's going to be great. When I get this amount of money, it's going to be great. But we get desensitized. We get used to having that house. We get used to having that car. We get used to having that money. And then we want more, and it's never satisfactory. And I think that's exactly what the author's touching up on. So here we continue at verse 9 of chapter 4. 2 are better than 1, because they have a good reward for their toil. For if they fall, one will lift up his fellow. But woe to him who is alone when he falls, and has not another to lift him up. Again, if 2 lie together, they keep warm. But how can one keep warm alone? And though a man might prevail against one who is alone, 2 will withstand him. A threefold cord is not quickly broken. So I really like this too because in the few things that the author says that you should do in this life, one of them being, rejoice in his work in chapter 3, verse 22. Another thing he says to do in this life is to make sure you're not alone. And, like something interesting about hermits, I think hermits actually die much sooner than normal people on average. We are relational beings and we're meant to be with one another. So don't ever shut out those who are around you. Bring them in close and look to have a close relationship with them. Especially if you're a Christian, it's like really love one another, do things for one another. Like I said about love is sacrificial, it's through actions. Do things for other people. And with that, you're going to grow this really nice, great relationship. And, it says, but woe to him who is alone when he falls and has not another to lift him up. It's verse 10 in chapter 4. To lift him up. So when you've loved someone and you're close with that person, you form that intimate relationship. Now, even when you've fallen in a huge way, taking a big fall, the people who are closest to you can help you the most. So strive to give them the potential to help you as much as you will ever need to do that. Do that with people. Be a relational person. Be a person who takes joy in the relationships with you and sees it as a gift from God, because that's exactly what it is. So we'll continue at verse 13 in the last section of this chapter. I believe it is. Yes, it is. Okay, chapter 4, verse 13. Better was a poor and wise youth than an old and foolish king who no longer knew how to take advice. For he went from prison to the throne, though in his own kingdom he had been poor, or he had been born poor. I saw all the living who move about under the sun, along with that youth who has to stand in the king's place. There was no end of all the people, all of whom he led. Yet those who come later will not rejoice in him. Surely this also is vanity and a striving after wind. So, kind of in the beginning, he's saying this is another reason why I think just the evidence for the authorship of Solomon is just really good, because it's really reminiscent of Proverbs. In verse 13, better was a poor and wise youth than an old and foolish king who no longer knew how to take advice. It just has like Proverbs written all over it, and there's so much truth to that. When you start going into Proverbs, Solomon starts talking a lot more about what can happen if you stop taking advice, if you're foolish, if you're prideful and you refuse to take that correction or reproof, as he says. But then he kind of goes into kind of a little bit about kingship and sort of a kingdom, if you will. So you have like, there was no end of all the people, all of whom he led. So you could have this huge kingdom and you can have a lot of people following you, but yet those who come later will not rejoice in him. Surely this also is vanity and a striving after the wind. Yeah, so it's like, even if you do come to power, kind of tying this all back together, even if you do come to power, power still isn't enough, right? Because there's going to come a time where, let's say you rule for a very long time, and I'm not just talking about kingdoms. I'm talking about maybe in a company, or I guess in a government too, or even much more simply, just kind of a large congregation of people. If you rule for so long, there's going to come a point where people are going to forget maybe how good you were, hopefully if you were good. They're going to forget how good you were in the first place, why you should be there in the first place if you're a good leader. And they're going to be desensitized to it, just like how people become desensitized to riches that they have, that I talked about a few minutes ago. And they won't exactly rejoice in you who has power, the one who is the leader. They just get desensitized. And that's also very biblical. You see that within throughout the Old Testament. You see these great kings, these great leaders, starting with especially Moses, and then you get to David, even Solomon too, and these great kings. And then after generations go through, even like in Moses' own lifetime, as the generations go, people just forget what God did for them, how God used Moses to lead them. They just forget how to do that, or they forget to acknowledge that. And then as the generation goes, people forget about all that David did to establish the kingdom of Israel, and even to all that Solomon did, because I think Solomon was one of the last really godly kings of Israel, if I remember correctly, going through the book of Kings. Um, his sons, they were trying to, and then, but the world started creeping in a little bit. And then grandsons, great grandsons, as the generations come, they just forget that all that what David did, David being father of Solomon. So that's very biblical in the Old Testament. So anyways, that wraps up the Bible study for today. That's chapter 3 and 4. Really great content getting into. I think chapter 3 it's one of my favorite chapters in the Bible. Like I said, Ecclesiastes is one of my favorite books of the Bible. And I hope at this point, you're starting to see why maybe I like it so much. And I don't know, maybe you will like it too. And I think this is a really good book to kind of talk to people who don't really believe in Christianity, because even in the Bible, they understand what life is like outside of believing in God and having that relationship with God, because you see that in Ecclesiastes. Because Solomon, in a sense, is kind of looking at the world in a secular view. He's saying, okay, well, how much is work worth? How much are riches really worth? How much is power really worth? How much is pleasure really worth? And he, at the end of the day, he keeps saying all is vanity. And then, as we will see later on in a few weeks what he has to say about God. So I really look forward to continuing on in this book. And like I said, just to wrap up, we went through the idea of eternity, how there's that desire deep within us for eternity. And then we went into the idea of evil. I didn't really get to talk that much about the text in that first little section, verses 1 through 3 of chapter 4. But I think we kind of get the broad message of that, and chapter 4 getting into sort of evil, and then more about eternity as well. So that makes chapter 3 and 4 of Ecclesiastes. And I hope to see you in the next video when we go into chapters 5 and 6. I'm looking forward to that as well. And I hope you learned something from today. And I'd love for some feedback. Maybe you're uncertain about something I said. Maybe I was unclear about something. Maybe you disagree about something. I always invite constructive criticism, and then also feedback and some dialogue too. You could always tweet at me at tmauk_2. That's TMAUK_2. And just reach out to me, and let's have a discussion. I always look forward to those. But that being said, that wraps up the Bible study for this week. And for those of you who've joined me, I'm really thankful. And I just ask maybe share this with others, share what you've learned with others, and hey, it would kind of help me out if you maybe share the video with others on more social media platforms. But all right, I will end it there. Thank you. Lastly, thank you for joining me, and take care. I'll see you next week.